Okay, welcome back. And this chapter that I'm going to cover today is from Jacques Ellul's The Technological Society, Chapter 4, Technique and the State. And this is a very big, long chapter with a lot in it, but it's very important to me because it establishes, probably better than any other chapter, Ellul's political philosophy. So I recorded my talk about this, then I had to go back and do it again. And I actually wrote this out because this is a difficult one. There's a whole lot going on in this chapter, and I just felt like I needed to write it out in order to try to get a better handle on it and give you not just some random points, but more of a picture of the whole of the argument here. So this may sound a little different because I'm reading, but hopefully it will go okay. Chapter 4 is Technique and the State, and this is where Ellul probably comes closest to developing his political theory in this book. On page 232, he says, quote, "In spite of the frequent mention of Machiavelli's Prince, the truth is that until the beginning of the 20th century, no one ever drew the technical consequences of that work. What existed then was a kind of original chaos in which the man of genius always outclassed his adversaries because they never had at their disposal a technique which sufficed to redress the balance. The beginnings of a political technique had to await the appearance of Lenin." End quote. Well, what he said there struck me as particularly important because he is aligning his observations about technique with a fundamental thinker in political philosophy. It's true that Machiavelli would probably be very pleased with the technological advances that are now at the state's disposal. Machiavelli admired leaders who could get exactly what they wanted and grow the state's power while making people like it and cooperate willingly. For Machiavelli, that was the height of political genius, and he would have loved the use of propaganda in the interest of the state that Ellul talks about in this chapter. During Machiavelli's time, propaganda was at a very low level. Machiavelli was the first to discuss that the prince used propaganda in a conscious way. The prince could go to church, give out alms, punish criminals randomly in order to make a point about his power. He could institute festivals and celebrations for the people, etc. Machiavelli knew that these types of gestures would help gain the support of the people, who could then be put to use in the new popular military, the citizens' militia that he advocated. So Machiavelli was on the leading edge of propaganda, but if Machiavelli could see how far we'd come in the area of technology and planning today, he would probably be blown away. However, Machiavelli would not be pleased with Ellul's next suggestion in this chapter. That is, in the modern situation, technique rules the state rather than the state ruling and utilizing technique. So today's prince is in a similar situation to Machiavelli's common people. Our government thinks that it is using technology and planning for its purposes, but meanwhile, truly, it's the servant of technological and organizational advances. In a sense, what he's described in this chapter is technique tricking the state into the position of submission. The state has a will to power, and it sees private techniques to its benefit. So, as private techniques get to a level where they're difficult for individuals or private enterprise to be able to advance effectively because of the immense cost and level of coordination, just about then, the state sees them to its own advantage, and in its inevitable pursuit of power, it absorbs them. It absorbs the private techniques either directly or indirectly. He talks about how in America and in other democratic countries, the state often does both. Here's an example of what he's talking about updated to the current level of development. The state absorbs privately developed techniques directly in the sense of, for instance, creating Medicaid and Medicare and the Affordable Care Act to provide modern medical care for people in need, and then contracting with corporations in the so-called private sector to provide the services. It indirectly absorbs by such means as creating programs that encourage students to go into scientific fields for their higher education, funding medical research, subsidizing hospital and research facilities, structuring the tax code to benefit some medical enterprises over others, structuring the tax code to encourage charitable donations for scientific and medical research, and creating huge public education programs to stimulate the use of new medical techniques provided by state-of-the-art medical facilities, etc. All of this vastly improves the power of the state relative to the individual and the community. But notice, it also means that the state is so intricately tied up with the development of techniques and the support of all that by corporations that it cannot conceive of extricating itself. That means that the state no longer can function effectively to represent the people when their interests are contrary to the interests of the development of new and better and bigger techniques. In this situation, where technique is riding the state rather than the state riding and utilizing technique, we get a division between the experts and technicians that are carrying out the government's tasks and the political representatives that are supposed to be carrying out the will of the people. This is the political administrative dichotomy. The problem is not just with the growing bureaucracy, but also with the vastly growing corporate power that's attached to government in many, many ways. In both cases, technicians and experts have the vast majority of power. Here's a quote from page 258. He says, "Similarly, the United States has shown a desire to establish a truly independent corps of political technicians as opposed to politicians, and to separate completely the political organ of decision from the technical organ of preparation. The task of the expert is to furnish the politician with information and estimates on which he conveys a decision. A clearly defined division of responsibility corresponds to this functional division. That is, the expert has no responsibility. The problem is, above all else, to maintain the independence of the technician. He must avoid pressures, involvement in contests of influence, and the personal quarrels of the members of the administration. When the technician has completed his task, he indicates to the politicians the possible solutions in the probable consequences, and then he retires." End quote. But you see, this is where the ethical problem lies. The technical expert class vastly outnumbers the political class at this point. The technical class supposedly has no responsibility because in a democracy, as well as any other political regime, the rulers are supposed to be responsible. In the case of democracy, the rulers would ultimately be the voters, but the voters are in absolutely no position to be able to have actual influence of any magnitude on either the giant government apparatus or the very much interwoven corporate apparatus. This is why Ellul basically says that at this point democracy is a sham and not a reality. This is despite the fact that both voters and most politicians would say otherwise. Here's another quote. This one is from page 264. He says, "With the technicians in charge of the state changes its character. For him, the state is not the expression of popular will or a creation of God, or the essence of humanity, or a modality of class warfare. It's an enterprise with certain services which ought to function properly. It's an enterprise which ought to be profitable, yield a maximum of efficiency, and have the nation for its working capital." This quote, when you really understand it, is kind of chilling. Notice that the people have become the working capital for the technicians or for technique generally, instead of for either private enterprise or the state. When he says the modality of class warfare, he's talking about the communist notion that the state is not the expression of, say, democratic will, but it is for winning the class war, right? In this case, though, truly the people have become just more or less tools, is another word for it, in the drive for advancement of technique. This sentiment goes to the heart of Ellul's dystopian reputation. These developments also seem inevitable. In this chapter, he talks about several ways that people try to fight back against the advancement of technique, but he shoots all of them down, the biggest of which is democratic action, and we've just seen how he shoots that down. He says, the nation is no longer primarily a human, geographic, and historical entity. It is an economic power whose resources must be put to work, into which a yield must be returned. Political doctrine is nothing more than a justification for the advancement of technique, then. There is a technique for creating political doctrines. It involves public opinion polling, focus groups, observation of economic indicators, etc. To get right to the heart of the matter, to the extent that people in the United States have been feeling as though both Democratic and Republican parties are too much alike each other, and that the outcomes do not differ much between the two, that things keep going down the wrong track and the same track regardless of how they vote, and they're becoming angry about it, they're sensing the developments that Ellul elaborates in this chapter. The most recent election could be seen as a sort of spasm of anger and confusion on the part of a people thoroughly disillusioned with the traditional political process. There's much to understand here, but people are constantly being thrown off by the political theater that goes on constantly at this point and prevents them from having any sort of overall objective view about what is occurring in their own country. Ellul prophesies this discontent on page 301 when he says, "Man is gradually losing his illusions about technique and his bedazzlement with it. He's becoming aware that he has not created an instrument of freedom, but a new set of chains. This appears with compelling clarity when the state exploits the technical instruments." Well, there he invokes Rousseau, which is interesting. This whole notion that man was born free, but now everywhere he's in chains, an idea that was also picked up by Marx. But Ellul is using it for his own purposes here, and the chains that he's talking about are kind of the gilded chains of the technological society, where totalitarianism functions in such a smooth way that people are not aware of it as they would have been in the old totalitarian regimes of the 20th century, namely communism and fascism. There's no more of the brutal, heavy-handed tactics, Ellul says earlier in this chapter, but rather everything is smoothed and paved for people to become those instruments of technique. So at the end of this chapter, we may ask ourselves, well, what is the solution? You know, he's gone into great detail now at this point in the book to describe the problem and the development of the problem and the effects of the problem. Well, this chapter ends with no positive solution for extracting ourselves from the domination of technique. However, I have to think that he would have not written this book had he not any suggestion to make. And I think the awareness that he indicates in that previous quote is the beginning of a solution. A big part of the solution is simply becoming aware of the problem. And that discontent that I mentioned a little bit earlier is maybe a glimmer of that awareness, very flawed, very incomplete glimmer, but still a glimmer of awareness. And for that reason, it shouldn't be simply dismissed. From this perspective, take note that the left-right divide is an illusion that covers up the larger problem and keeps people focused on something that they can feel that they have some control over through the political process. Today, people are beginning to look for new perspectives that surmount the left-right divide, and Ellul's theory seems to offer one way of doing so. And for that reason, the theory itself is a source of hope. It itself may be flawed and incomplete, and it may feel a little outdated simply because of some of the examples that are used, although it's very forward-thinking, and I think prophetic in some ways. And so what I've been trying to do in the treatment of these chapters is just to give people an overview of this, and I hope that they go and read it for themselves. I've got, looks like the next chapter is chapter 5, Human Techniques. And so I will come back hopefully next week. I've been managing to do a chapter a week so far, and I think I can keep that up. And do the chapter on human techniques. So we're not too far away from the end, and I'll see you next week. Bye.